I came to recognize a form of power that almost no one wants to acknowledge, a power concealed within individuals who choose to walk alone. Society is quick to label them as damaged, antisocial, or emotionally deficient, but what I observed was something far more unsettling. These individuals were not weaker than others. They were, in many cases, psychologically stronger than anyone around them. What I uncovered about people who deliberately keep no close friends was not merely controversial, it was destabilizing. It challenged assumptions so deeply ingrained that I cautioned my colleagues to approach these individuals with care, not because they were dangerous in the conventional sense, but because they were immune to forces that quietly govern nearly everyone else. Society frames the loner as a failure of adaptation, yet my research suggested the opposite. It revealed something that threatens the very structure by which human relationships are organized and maintained. What became increasingly clear to me was that compulsory socialization, the unquestioned belief that constant connection is healthy, is the true pathology. The loner is not a deviation from evolution, but a refinement of it. They represent a psychological direction humanity has been unconsciously moving toward for thousands of years. The real mystery is not why some people can exist alone, but why so many are terrified of solitude. Why do people endure shallow bonds, emotional manipulation, and corrosive relationships simply to avoid sitting alone with their own thoughts? My clinical record showed a consistent and unsettling pattern. Those who lived without friends were not impaired in social understanding. Instead, they had developed resistance to one of the most powerful mechanisms of human control, the collective need for approval. They were no longer governed by groupthink, by the hunger for validation, or by the invisible psychological contracts that bind most people to expectations they never consciously agreed to uphold. These individuals could not be coerced through shame, exclusion, or social pressure because they did not rely on the group to define their worth. I came to describe this as psychological independence. Most people believe they are autonomous thinkers, freely making choices based on personal values. But my work on the collective unconscious revealed a different truth. Human behavior is largely synchronized beneath awareness. People adopt the same opinions, pursue similar ambitions, and fear the same judgments, all while believing these impulses originate from within. Clothing, careers, relationships, even moral stances often emerge from absorbed group patterns rather than conscious choice. Reflect on how often decisions are filtered through imagined reactions of others. Which path looks respectable, which belief feels safe to express, which version of yourself will secure acceptance. These calculations happen constantly, silently transferring authority over one's life to an unseen audience. The loner exists beyond this system, not as an act of rebellion, but because they never integrated into it. Their psychological development followed a different trajectory. While others learned to regulate their emotional states through approval and belonging, the loner learned to self-regulate in isolation. Their nervous system adapted to silence instead of applause. Where other children needed laughter and affirmation to feel grounded, the loner learned stability alone. During adolescence, when peers sought identity through social mirrors, the loner found coherence internally. This produces an individual who cannot be controlled through threats of rejection. Exclusion holds no power over someone who never depended on inclusion. Such a person can observe the group without needing to merge with it, and that position alone is deeply unsettling to systems built on conformity. As I documented case after case, I realized I was not studying dysfunction. I was observing the rare humans who had escaped an invisible psychological enclosure that holds most people captive. The loner becomes a dangerous observer. Much like the empath archetype, they stand apart and study human behavior with remarkable precision. While others are busy performing roles, maintaining appearances, and protecting identities, the loner watches the mechanisms behind the performance. They notice the contradictions between words and actions, the self-deceptions people rely on to preserve comfort, and the recurring patterns that surface across families, workplaces, and cultures. They see how moral posturing coexists with private betrayal, how loyalty is proclaimed while sabotage unfolds quietly, how kindness is displayed publicly while cruelty operates in private spaces. This is not bitterness or cynicism. It is pattern recognition stripped of the need to preserve social harmony. Because the loner is not invested in approval, their perception remains undistorted. Over time, This observational stance cultivates a level of social intelligence most people never achieve. They understand human behavior not through participation, but through clarity. Yet this clarity carries a cost. Once you understand the game, you can no longer play it innocently. Once the patterns reveal themselves, pretending otherwise becomes impossible. The loner's awareness becomes the very thing that isolates them, because voicing these truths destabilizes the unspoken agreements that allow groups to function. Every collective relies on shared denial. Families silently agree not to address a parent's addiction. Workplaces ignore abusive leadership to preserve stability. Friend groups overlook manipulation to avoid conflict. These agreements maintain cohesion, but they demand silence. The individual who names what everyone sees becomes a threat, not because they are wrong, but because they disrupt the illusion holding the structure together. This is why the loner is often mislabeled as lonely. I became fixated on separating these concepts because the confusion causes profound harm. Loneliness is an unchosen wound, a painful yearning for connection denied. It drives people to seek company that diminishes them, to accept disrespect, to remain in environments that erode their integrity simply to avoid being alone. Solitude is something entirely different. It is a deliberate state, a psychological asset. Those who choose it are not broken. They are undergoing transformation. Solitude grants access to one's own consciousness without interference. It allows the nervous system to finally rest from processing the emotions, expectations, and projections of others. In that quiet space, clarity emerges. You begin to recognize what you genuinely believe, what you truly desire, and which values are yours rather than inherited. Solitude is where false identities dissolve and authentic perception forms. It is not an absence of connection, but a reconnection with something far more fundamental, the self, unfiltered and unafraid. You begin to discover what you genuinely enjoy, not what you were instructed to enjoy, not what earns approval or belonging, but what actually resonates when no one is watching. Your authentic preferences, values, and desires come into focus. The lonely person is damaged by isolation, but the solitary person is strengthened by it. I spent years examining the distinction and realized that true loners do not experience loneliness in the same way others do. What most people feel as absence, they experience as clarity. What others feel as deprivation, they experience as relief. It is freedom from the constant, exhausting performance required to remain socially acceptable. Where others feel hollow in solitude, the loner feels complete. Where others grow anxious without continual social feedback, the loner becomes calm and internally organized. When a loner is forced into social situations, the sensation is not connection, but interference, like static interrupting a clear transmission. This is not dysfunction or pathology. It reflects a nervous system configured differently, one that processes social input as noise rather than nourishment. Rituals that others find reassuring feel like elaborate expenditures of energy with little return. Feigned interest in subjects that carry no meaning creates fatigue instead of engagement. I observed that loners frequently leave social interactions depleted rather than energized, not because they are merely introverted in the conventional sense, but because they are constantly registering the discrepancy between what people say and what they actually mean. They watch individuals perform socially acceptable roles while simultaneously detecting the emotions leaking through the performance. This double awareness is taxing. Solitude is not simply a preference, it becomes essential for psychological recovery and equilibrium. I found that loners are often the only ones willing to confront their own darker aspects. I refer to this as the shadow, the parts of the psyche you were taught to reject, suppress, or disown and project onto others. Most people spend their lives fleeing from this shadow, hiding within groups where blame can be externalized. Within the group, it is easy to point outward and declare that cruelty, weakness, or corruption exists elsewhere, never within oneself. Group belonging offers endless opportunities for projection. You can avoid recognizing your own capacity for cruelty by condemning it in others. You can evade your own dishonesty by obsessing over the dishonesty of those around you. You can deny insecurity by ridiculing it wherever you see it. The collective becomes a hall of mirrors where everyone distributes their shadow outward, and no one is required to face it directly. The loner does not have this escape. Extended time alone eventually forces an encounter with everything you have been avoiding. Your selfish impulses, your aggression, your fear, your fragility, every trait you were told was unacceptable comes into view. In solitude, there is no scapegoat, no comparison, no distraction from your own psychological reality. I found that loners who endure this confrontation and integrate their shadow emerge psychologically stronger than those who rely on group concealment. Once you have faced your darkness and survived, it no longer terrifies you. You are no longer governed by the fear of exposure. Shame loses its power as a mechanism of control because you have already seen the worst and accepted it. This produces a stability that cannot easily be shaken. A person who has integrated their shadow knows they are capable of selfishness, so accusations of selfishness no longer collapse their identity. They recognize their potential for cruelty, so discovering it within themselves does not fracture their self-image. They have accepted the full range of their humanity, light and dark together. Paradoxically, this makes them less dangerous than those who deny their shadow, because awareness of one's capacity for harm creates the possibility of choice. This integration leads to what I call psychological sovereignty. The loner who has faced their inner darkness cannot be manipulated by threats of exposure. They already know what they are capable of and have made peace with it. They cannot be blackmailed, shamed, or easily controlled through the social mechanisms that keep most people compliant. I documented this process within myself during my confrontation with the unconscious. I spent years in isolation engaging with psychological material that would have overwhelmed many people. I experienced visions that could have been labeled pathological. I felt emotions intense enough to precipitate collapse. I encountered aspects of myself that contradicted everything I wished to believe about my own character. I did not flee from these experiences. I examined them, studied them, and integrated them. I emerged fundamentally transformed, no longer afraid of my own mind, no longer dependent on external validation, psychologically whole in a way most people never reach. My work on the shadow archetypes and the process of individuation arose from my willingness to remain alone with inner realities that frighten me. The psychological development of the loner follows this same trajectory. Solitude compels shadow integration. Shadow integration produces sovereignty. Sovereignty threatens every structure built on regulating behavior through shame, fear, and social pressure. This is where my research becomes genuinely unsettling. The loner who has integrated their shadow and attained psychological sovereignty reaches a point where they can make decisions that deeply disturb the group. They can leave toxic systems without hesitation. They can articulate truths without concern for reputational damage. They can act in accordance with their own values even when those values conflict with collective expectations. I call this moment the snap, not a collapse or breakdown, but an instant of absolute clarity in which action becomes inevitable, because the approval of the group is no longer required. These individuals make choices the collective cannot comprehend and often perceives as threatening. They are the ones who risk their status to name realities everyone senses, but refuses to articulate. They walk away from prestigious roles when the work violates their integrity. They choose honesty over belonging even when belonging would be easier, safer, and more profitable. The group responds harshly because such actions undermine the unspoken agreements that sustain the system. Institutions exile those who speak out. Social circles isolate those who disrupt the narrative. Families designate as scapegoats the members who refuse to uphold collective denial. The loner who has reached psychological sovereignty cannot be governed by systems that depend on social pain for control. Exclusion loses its power when inclusion was never the source of worth. Shame becomes ineffective once the shadow has been consciously faced and integrated. Attacks on reputation carry no weight when identity was never built on external approval. This is what makes the loner dangerous, not because they are malicious, but because they are free. And freedom is the greatest threat to any structure that survives through compliance and fear. A person who cannot be manipulated, shamed, or coerced is capable of dismantling entire power systems simply by refusing to participate in them. They can decline opportunities others desperately chase. They can walk away from relationships others endure out of habit or fear. They can question beliefs others defend reflexively, without ever examining whether those beliefs are true. After decades of observing this pattern, I arrived at a conclusion that unsettles many people. The loner is not broken. The loner is evolved. They represent a form of human consciousness that develops outside the limits of collective unconscious programming. They are not lacking something that others possess. They are accessing something most people never encounter. The majority of individuals live according to mental code absorbed from culture without ever questioning whether that code serves them. Definitions of success, assumptions about love, rules about which emotions are acceptable, and scripts about how life is supposed to unfold are inherited rather than chosen. This programming runs silently in the background, shaping decisions that feel deeply personal, but are actually repetitions of collective patterns lived out across millions of lives. The loner is someone who refused the download and wrote their own operating system. This makes them incompatible with standard social systems, but it also makes them capable of insights and innovations that groupthink can never produce. Unbound by collective agreements about what is possible, they can perceive solutions others cannot imagine. Because they are not invested in preserving the status quo, they can advocate for change where others remain silent out of fear. History repeatedly confirms this. Many of humanity's greatest breakthroughs emerged from loners. Artists who worked in obscurity for years before recognition arrived. Scientists who pursued questions dismissed as foolish or impossible. Philosophers who voiced ideas no one wanted to hear. Inventors who labored alone while others called them insane. These individuals could see beyond the invisible fences imposed by consensus. The true legacy of the loner is not isolation, but liberation. Not only for themselves, but for anyone who witnesses a human being living by inner values rather than external expectations. Every loner who achieves psychological sovereignty demonstrates that survival outside the group is possible, that the shadow can be faced and integrated, that freedom from collective control can be attained if one is willing to pay the price of solitude. I understand this intimately because I lived it. My separation from Freud left me professionally isolated. Former colleagues dismissed me, my work was ridiculed, and my exploration of the unconscious led me into psychological territory few were willing to enter. That solitude, however, produced some of the most transformative insights in the history of psychology, ideas that reshaped our understanding of consciousness and continue to influence psychology, philosophy, and spirituality today. The loner who keeps no friends is not rejecting connection. They are protecting their consciousness from interference so they can access truths that constant participation in the collective obscures. They are not failing at relationships. They are succeeding at something most people never attempt, the creation of a fully individuated self capable of thinking its own thoughts, feeling its own emotions, and living according to its own values. The world needs loners, not because they are superior, but because they perceive what others cannot. They think thoughts others fear. They ask questions others have been conditioned not to ask. They explore possibilities others are too controlled to attempt. Every system requires individuals who can step outside it and determine whether it still serves its original purpose, or whether it has become self-perpetuating regardless of harm. If you are someone who keeps no friends, understand this: you are not broken. You are not defective. You are not missing something everyone else has. You are accessing something most people never find. Your solitude is not a flaw to be fixed. It is a strength to be protected. Your resistance to conformity is not weakness. It is immunity to one of the most powerful control systems ever created. Your discomfort in social situations is not pathology. It is your nervous system recognizing that performing a false self is more damaging than standing alone as your authentic self. The most dangerous truth I uncovered is that the loner represents human potential freed from collective limitation. Psychological sovereignty and inner independence are precisely what control systems fear most. Not because loners seek to destroy society, but because their existence proves that society's mechanisms of control are optional, that you can choose differently, that you can be psychologically whole without validation from people who never examine themselves. The loner is not dangerous because they are evil. They are dangerous because they are free. And freedom is contagious. Every individual who achieves sovereignty through solitude and shadow integration silently grants permission for others to attempt the same journey. This is why groups punish loners so harshly, not because loners harm anyone, but because their existence threatens the unspoken agreements that keep everyone else obedient.